monitoring mission in Ukraine for producing the OHCHR report published yesterday. The United Kingdom welcomes this report and its findings. To date, it is the most comprehensive and independent assessment of the human rights situation in Ukraine since the onset of this crisis. It is therefore an important contribution to our discussions on the situation in Ukraine. Attempts to discredit the report as biased or politically motivated, as my Russian colleague has just done, lack all credibility. Madam President, the OHCHR report is clear that human rights violations were a root cause of the popular protests which began in November last year. The report found that since the change of government in late February, allegations of human rights violations have decreased. But we do not underestimate the magnitude of the task ahead. In this regard, it is encouraging that the OHCHR report finds, and I quote, clear indications of a willingness by the present government to ensure a break with the past injustices and to elaborate a new vision for Ukraine's future. The United Kingdom is fully committed to supporting Ukraine in this endeavour. Madam President, the OHCHR report comprehensively refutes assertions made by the Russian Federation in this chamber and elsewhere to justify its illegal intervention in Ukraine. And I will give just 3 examples. First, on the 1st of March, President Putin requested authority to use Russia's armed forces in Ukraine on the basis that there was, and I quote, a threat to the lives of citizens of the Russian Federation, our compatriots, and the personnel of the armed forces. This claim, oft repeated, underpinned Russia's justification for military intervention in Ukraine. But the OHCHR report concludes that, in fact, attacks against the ethnic Russian community in Ukraine were, quote, neither widespread nor systematic. It further assesses, and I quote, Russian speakers have not been subject to threats in Crimea. This finding supports those of other independent authorities, including the OSCE High Commissioner for National Minorities, who also found no evidence of violations or threats to the lives of Russian speakers. Second, Russia bases its justification for the illegal annexation of Crimea on the legitimacy of the 16 March referendum. On 18 March, in his address to the Russian Duma, President Putin said, and I quote, a referendum was held in Crimea on 16 March in full compliance with democratic procedures and international norms. In stark contrast to this bold assertion, the report concludes that, quote, the presence of paramilitary and so-called self-defense groups, as well as soldiers in uniform without insignia, widely believed to be from the Russian Federation, was not conducive to an environment in which the will of the voters could be exercised freely. The report also states, and I quote, the OHCHR delegation received many reports of vote rigging, including cases of non-Ukrainian citizens participating in the referendum, as well as individuals voting numerous times in different locations. Overall, the report expresses, and I quote, serious concern about violations of the civil and political rights of the inhabitants of Crimea. And it cites cases of abduction, unlawful arrest and detention, harassment and violence against peaceful demonstrators, arbitrary arrest and torture. It also expresses deep concern at the consequences of introducing Russian citizenship and estimates that 3,000 Crimean Tatars have been displaced. Lastly, the report contains damning evidence that Russia has used propaganda and misinformation to exacerbate tensions and to destabilize Ukraine. It says that the Russian state television and radio broadcasting company has been, and I quote, disguising information about Kiev events in an attempt to justify Crimea's return to the Russian Federation. Moreover, the report states that greatly exaggerated stories and misinformed reports were, quote, systematically used to create a climate of fear and insecurity, end quote, to support Russia's case for the annexation of Crimea. Madam President, turning to current events, the United Kingdom supports fully the right of freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. Those Ukrainians who wish to demonstrate against the government are entitled to do so, provided that they do so peacefully. But there is a line. Well-equipped paramilitary units armed with automatic weapons are not peaceful protesters. A legitimate sovereign state must insist on a monopoly of the use of force. We express particular concern, as Mr. Simonovic did in his briefing today, about the arming of protesters and their transformation into quasi-paramilitary forces. Yesterday, the Ukrainian government began an operation to restore law and order in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian Prime Minister stated that operations will proceed gradually, responsibly and prudently. The Foreign Minister emphasized that the operations were initiated only after all other means to resolve the situation had been exhausted. And we have received assurances that the operation will comply fully with Ukrainian and international law, safeguard human rights, and uphold Ukraine's international obligations. The Ukrainian government has acted responsibly throughout this crisis, even in the face of immense provocation, not least the illegal annexation of its territory, and despite continuing interference from Russia. We therefore have confidence that Ukrainian security forces will continue to act proportionately and in the interests of all citizens of Ukraine. We have heard from the permanent representative of Russia today a new fantasy narrative about developments in eastern Ukraine. I have no doubt that future independent reports from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights will prove this new narrative to be as false as the Russian narrative on Crimea has comprehensively been shown to be. We remind Russia that it cannot use the situation in Ukraine, for which it bears significant responsibility, as a pretext for further illegal military activity. Madam President, our appeal to Russia is simple. Stop interfering in the internal affairs of Ukraine. Move your troops away from Ukraine's borders. Rescind the authorization to use military force in Ukraine and enter into dialogue. The European Union want to see Russia as a partner, as a friend, and as an ally. A stable, peaceful, and prosperous Ukraine is just as much in Russia's interests as it is in our own. So rather than pursuing a strategy of destabilization, we call on Russia to take its place at the negotiating table and explain its concerns. We hope that the quadripartite talks scheduled for 17 April will provide just such an opportunity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you so much, Madam President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Simonovic, for your briefing today and for your diligent work on this controversial issue. We meet today to discuss the work of the UN's Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the timely report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. After weeks of Russian disinformation and propaganda, this gives us yet another opportunity to focus on facts. The independent and impartial reporting we have heard today is essential to prevent the kind of distortions that may lead to further instability in an already combustible situation, a situation that continues to grow more dangerous every day. Today's remarks by the Russian Federation, where the independent report provided by the UN was disparaged, indeed slandered, as biased and unfounded, is deeply worrying. If you don't like the message, the Russian strategy appears to be, metaphorically, shoot the messenger. Even if these attacks are attacks on the entire international community, which asks the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to provide independent reporting. We urge the UN to continue to provide independent reporting and not to be deterred by slander and intimidation being practiced by those who do not like facts that have proven inconvenient and truths that credibly refute Russia's false and self-justifying claims. Let us be clear, the actions the world witnessed in Crimea and the denials of Russian involvement in the lead up to its illegal annexation and occupation are repeating themselves in eastern Ukraine. Again, a region has been transformed almost overnight from a state of relative calm to manufactured unrest. Over the last several days, heavily armed pro-Russian separatists have seized the city administration, police stations, and other government buildings in 11 cities in Donetsk Oblast. Every major city in the region has at least one building under occupation. It is clear that these actions were not a set of spontaneous events or homegrown, but rather a well-orchestrated professional campaign of incitement, separatism, and sabotage of the Ukrainian state. And there is substantial evidence of involvement from Russia, which is now diverting attention from its own actions, its own territorial expansion, its own fear-mongering, by trying to change the subject. Well, it won't work. The contrast between the actions of the Ukrainian government and those of the Russian troops could not be starker. Ukrainian security forces have responded more carefully and in more measured ways to provocations in the east that would be difficult for any of us to accept in our own countries. The Ukrainian government has repeatedly sought to negotiate with the armed groups that have seized public buildings and established unauthorized roadblocks in eastern Ukraine in an effort to resolve the situation peacefully through dialogue. Ukrainian officials have offered amnesty. We appreciate the government's statements that any actions it undertakes will be gradual and responsible, and contrary to the conspiracy theories put forth by the Russian representative just now, we continue to call for restraint, privately and publicly. Obviously, the best way to de-escalate this situation is for the armed militants to leave the buildings that they have seized. While this report speaks to an earlier period in the crisis, it is important to note that even several weeks ago, the monitoring mission had already received allegations that some of the people stoking unrest in the region were not Ukrainian citizens, but in fact agitators coming from the Russian Federation. Obviously, it is a critical question whether Russia is continuing its policy of seeking to destabilize and ultimately annex land from its neighbor. For purposes of establishing the truth, it is essential that the UN Human Rights Monitoring Commission go forward with its work and that it have full access to every part of the country, including Crimea. The United States commends the Ukraine government for facilitating the mission's activities and also for supporting the OSCE's ongoing efforts to monitor every aspect of the scheduled May 25th elections. Now let us consider some of the truths set forward in the High Commissioner's report. From December of last year until February of 2014, the Berkut Special Police and other elements of the federal security apparatus used excessive force against anti-government protesters. This deadly violence did not end until former President Yanukovych abandoned his office and fled the country. Since late February, when the new government assumed office, evidence of human rights abuses has decreased dramatically, except in the Crimea, where Russian policies threatened the rights of Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and other minority groups. Let me emphasize that according to this new independent report, the only region of Ukraine that has suffered a rapid deterioration in human rights is the part over which the government in Kyiv has least control. In Crimea, where the role of Russian authorities is as profound as it is illegal, journalists and human rights defenders have faced harassment and torture, censorship is common, and the presence of paramilitary and soldiers, quote, widely believed to be from the Russian Federation, end quote, has sharply inhibited freedom of expression. The report raises valid concerns about the introduction of Russian citizenship in a region that does not belong to Russia. Discrimination against Ukrainian citizens inside their own country, and a plethora of practical issues related to property ownership, pensions, wages, healthcare, labor rights, education, and access to justice. The new report also examines the allegation repeated over and over again by Russian officials that there have been systematic attacks against ethnic Russians in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and that Jewish communities have also come under threat. The reality is that there have been a few isolated incidents against individual members belonging to minority groups, and we should and do condemn these incidents. But the report makes clear these incidents were neither widespread nor a reflection of government policy. On the contrary, the report presents vivid evidence that the Ukraine government has sought actively to safeguard the rights of all citizens within its jurisdiction. Madam President, it is revealing that while Russia has sought to deny the realities cited in the UN's new report, the leaders of Ukraine are making a good faith effort to implement its recommendations. Among other initiatives, they are moving ahead with constitutional reform, plans to decentralize power, preparations for the election, and initiatives to curb the corruption that flourished so blatantly under the former president. Overall, the new government has acted with tremendous restraint under extraordinarily difficult conditions. There will always be more to do, but the allegation that the government is primarily to blame for the present tensions is completely baseless. Before moving to my conclusion, I just wanted to draw on the even-handed recommendations in the UN Human Rights Report in order to show that the charges against the United Nations are inaccurate. Among the report's recommendations to the government of Ukraine are the following: ensure accountability for all human rights violations during the unrest, ensure inclusivity and equal participation in public affairs and political life, prevent media manipulation, combat intolerance and extremism, and implement measures to eradicate corruption. The recommendations to the authorities in Crimea include actively resolve cases of missing persons, take all measures needed to protect the rights of persons affected by the changing institutional and legal framework, including citizenship, disarm and disband paramilitary units, investigate hate speech and media manipulation. These are not the recommendations of a biased report. Madam President, the release of this Human Rights Monitoring Report should remind us all of our responsibilities. The government of Ukraine has a responsibility to continue its reform initiatives and to ensure inclusivity and respect for the human rights of all groups. The people of Ukraine have a duty to cooperate with their government and fellow citizens in seeking to resolve disputes through peaceful means. The Russian Federation has an obligation to fulfill its commitments under international law to respect the rights and the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine and to back its professed desire for stability with actions designed to achieve that goal instead of its opposite. The Russian Federation must move its troops back from the border region, withdraw its forces from Crimea, and cease all efforts to destabilize Ukraine. The international community has a responsibility to support the people of Ukraine in their desire to build a strong and united country with a robust democracy and effective national and regional institutions. We have a collective responsibility